Hello, friends! How is everybody doing today? This is just going to be a chill, laid-back stream. I know it's coming up on the holidays, and a lot of people are focusing on that, which is good. That's a good thing. You should be focusing on that. So, we're just going to chill, unwind, and talk about classic Final Fantasy and modern Final. We're just going to talk about Final Fantasy in general. That's the plan, at least. Make sure everything is set correctly, and it appears to be. For in-house bookkeeping, I will be adjusting my stream's layout, I guess is the best way of phrasing it. I will be adjusting my stream layout in the new year. I will be streaming on Twitch and uploading videos here. Yeah, if you haven't joined me on Twitch already, you should do so. Let me put a link in the locations for that. It's just, it's not anything terribly special, but exactly what you'd all expect. I think this will improve the quality of my YouTube content. That's very important to me. I want to make better YouTube videos, and I see myself as a YouTuber, not as a... One second, let me put that somewhere better. I see myself as a YouTuber, not as a Twitch streamer. But Twitch is going to be the best way for me to grow my channel, and it's going to be the best way for me to start making some money so I can do this more often and better and everything. So I'm going to start doing some stuff out over there. And then I will take what I do over there that is good and worthy of YouTube and put it on here. And probably trim out some of the stuff that you guys don't need, like, you know, this. Yeah, no, we'll just trim out some of the intros and some of the discussions and, you know, the channel updates and the stuff that you guys aren't really here for if you're watching this on YouTube. Final Fantasy. You guys know Final Fantasy. It's a fantastic series. It's been around for a very long time. So basically I'm going to be all over the web. In a sense, I mean, yeah, I will be in YouTube, I will be on Twitch. I'm not planning on doing anything on, like, you know, Glimish or, what's the other one? Trovo or, Picard. I'm not going to do any of the weird ones. Because the weird ones are weird, in summary. But Twitch does offer me things that I can't do on YouTube. So let's talk Final Fantasy I, shall we? Final Fantasy I is a phenomenal game. If you haven't played any Final Fantasies, 1 is not the one to start with. Do not start with Final Fantasy I, or any of its remakes, or any of its reimaginings that have been released, or... Well, maybe the new one that's coming out. That's not out yet. Final Fantasy Origins, I think it is? When is that coming out? Actually, let me check when that's coming out. No, Origins is one of the remakes. There's a new Final Fantasy... coming out, Final Fantasy I Remake, which seems strange because Final Fantasy I does not have very much meat to it. It's made for the NES. And to really talk about Final Fantasy I need to start talking about NES games. Because Final Fantasy I... Let me see. Let me pull up the exact release date. 1987. Now, for people who are a bit younger, let me give you some context for what that means. 87 is when Punch-Out, the original Punch-Out came out. The original Mega Man came out. The, like, Fox Xanadu. Contra 1. It was such a, an interesting landscape, and there were very few games that were long experiences, I guess you could say. And part of the reason it was named Final Fantasy is because it was the company's last-ditch effort to make a game. I believe that's pretty well documented, but Final Fantasy I was the company's swan song. It was their attempt to make a game before going out of business, and they made Final Fantasy because that was kind of their thing. It was their Final Fantasy. It was their final chance to grasp at a dream of being a video game publishing house and developer before they closed their doors. And they were fully cognizant of the fact that if Final Fantasy if Final Fantasy did not launch, then Square would go out of business. Squaresoft, not Square Enix at that time, of course. So, they did. But think of the landscape, though. Those are the games that I mentioned. Most of them are short. You can beat Contra with some practice in under an hour. I mean, a regular gameplay of Mario is only going to take you a couple of hours tops, right? You're not going to be playing the same game forever. And the games that you can play forever, your Galagas, your Twin Bees, your games like that, the games that you can play forever, they were too extremely repetitive in the content. It was the same content with a couple of different things. It's the same, I guess it's a little bit after something like Galaga. But, yeah. It was a new type of game. And it was inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, I believe is correct. So, they dropped a game that you could play for 80 hours before beating. Not play and replay, not play, and do the same content over and over again, which you could argue that you are because of the combat system, but not in the same way that you are with, replaying the same first level of Mario 1. The same 8 levels of Mario 1. It was all new, it was a very long game, and it was a very interesting concept. I'm trying to think if there were any other RPGs the real RPGs that predate it. And this came out the same year as Legend of Zelda 2 for the Game Boy. Or I'm sorry, no, Legend of Zelda 2 for the NES. Which is much more actiony take. Apart from the actual historical games like Nobunaga's Ambition and such, and I think there was probably a Napoleonic game back then as well. There was not a lot of games in that style, of that traditional RPG style. And there were many that emulated it and many that copied it straight out, but very few of the original design. When was the original Fire Emblem? 1990. The original Fire Emblem was 3 years after Final Fantasy 1. So, what are my memories with it? I didn't play it initially. I didn't play Final Fantasy 1 when it first came out. It's one of the games that I went back and played after I fell in love with the series. My first Final Fantasy was 4. But I did go back and play it, as I've played all but one mainline Final Fantasy, and we'll talk about that later, and why. But Final Fantasy 1, simply put, is an absolutely iconic game that aged very poorly. It is not the pinnacle of gaming. It started the pinnacle of gaming. Does that make sense? It started the concept and the genre and established so many genre tropes and concepts that we take for granted in modern gaming landscape. It's not any exaggeration at all to say that it completely iconified the RPG and revolutionized it at that. So then, what does it do wrong? What does it do right? It does a lot right, but it also does a lot wrong. Of the things it does right is actually taking the plunge, actually saying, hey, yes, we are willing to make a game that's going to take you, 30 hours to beat on your first playthrough. And that you can then play through again and take even longer on it. Actually, when did Saga 1 came out? That's actually an interesting question. Sorry, I just need to double check that. Saga 1. When did Saga come out? 89. Yeah, so Saga 1 came out 2 years after Final Fantasy. Again, what was the first JRPG if not Final Fantasy 1? Actually, let me just do a first quick hot check. I'm pretty sure it is the first. Aside from like weird Atari things, and counting the turn-based JRPG style combat as its concepts. So, what does it do wrong? The battles are repetitive. The battles are very samey, and although it is frankly stunning that they can get that much artwork and that much content and that many maps onto an NES cartridge, they reuse a lot of tile sets, they reuse a lot of enemy models, and they had to, right? They had to. There's only so much space on the cartridge, and that's perfectly fine. But it is worth saying that's, makes it tougher for a modern audience to go back and play again. But it is a game that has been remade many times. It's been remade into more modern hardware. Origins, the one I had mentioned earlier, Final Fantasy Origins. Was the remake for the, I want to say it was the Nintendo DS, or was that the Game Boy Advance? Oh, it was for the PlayStation. Oh gosh. Final Fantasy Origins for the PlayStation was a retelling of the same storyline with updated graphics and a couple of fixed models, but without completely editorializing and readjusting the entire concept of the game. There's not a lot of that you can do with a there's not a lot you can do without rewriting the game. I'm very curious to know, because there is going to be a new Final Fantasy 1 remake coming out that's supposedly getting the Final Fantasy 7 treatment of actually being completely remastered. But it's going to have to be completely redone everything, because the characters in Final Fantasy 1 have no characters. The characters have no lines. No character actually talks to you in Final Fantasy 1. They talk to you as a party, not as an individual. When they talk to you, they're talking to the group. They're not talking to Fighter the Fighter. There isn't a real named character in it. I'm checking the release date. Yep, 86. Oh yeah, so Dragon Quest did come out a year before Final Fantasy 1. But both were in development at the same time, and Final Fantasy takes the idea of the team-based system. Yeah, okay. So yeah, that was the prior JRPG. Thank you. Thank you. You're absolutely correct on that. It is worth going back and playing for the history. If you enjoy the historical aspect of gaming and games in general, then I would recommend going back and trying out Final Fantasy 1. But know that you're going to be in for a relatively rough ride. It's very unpolished by modern standards. Some games have aged better than others. This is something that we'll get into a lot more when we're talking about the early 3D ones, like 7. But the simple fact is that Final Fantasy 1 is a more interesting on a pedestal than actually playing. It's more interesting to put Final Fantasy 1 on a pedestal and think about it and analyze what's going on with it and consider what it means to the gaming landscape than to actually play the game. It's almost sad to say, right? Like, it's just, it didn't age well, it's hard to get into nowadays, and it's difficult to really appreciate and enjoy the way you could a long time ago, back when it first came out. And this isn't true of all the Final Fantasy games. I mean, especially when we talk about some of the mid-range ones, like 4, 5, and 6, which are still every bit as good now as they were when they first came out. But 1 is simply not that case. 2 takes an interesting take on the restructuring the concept slightly. Final Fantasy 2 takes the idea of the Final Fantasy genre and begins to right out of the gate experiment with it. 1 had your jobs, your white mage, black mage, red mage, your fighter, rogue, and monk. Final Fantasy 2 already tosses that out and goes to a classless system. Now, I'm a big fan of classless systems in general, but, anyways, Final Fantasy II is... Look, if you know, you know. Final Fantasy II takes the system sort of like Oblivion and Morrowind, the old Elder Scrolls style, where the more you use an ability, the better you get at it. As you play through the game, you do more with your various actions, and those actions improve. There is no Fire 2 spell. There is casting Fire 1 until it upgrades into Fire 2. And there's a problem with that. A very big problem. You lose access to Fire 1. There is no such thing as a small nuke if you keep on leveling up all of your magic, because your small nukes simply become bigger nukes that take more mana, which you might not want to have. You don't have a good basic attack option if you want to be a pure mage. Fun fact, I accidentally made a monk in that game. When I was playing that game, I took Maria, and I wanted Maria to be my mage. I wanted her to be my mage healer. But I kept on having combat rounds come up where I didn't really need to, cast anything, where I didn't want to waste mana, I didn't want to heal anybody, so I just hit attack, and I didn't have a weapon on her. Because I didn't buy her one, because none of the weapons increased magic. And she leveled up her unarmed skill. And she was very quickly out-damaging everybody else in the party. Because, well, I kept on attacking with unarmed, and unarmed scales regardless without relation to weapon type. So, yeah. I made an accidental monk. And it worked. I mean, it was an interesting concept. It worked pretty well, I have to say. Let me just adjust. Ba-ba-ba. Is that normal? Is that good? I don't know. It worked fine for me. I don't know if it's actually, like, a good thing, but, like... I don't know. I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's at least an inherently bad thing. But it's something that you need to consider, and something that I don't like. Because you don't have control over it. If leveling up Fire gave you access to Fire 2, and leveling up Fire 2 gave you access to Fire 3, that'd be fine. I'd be happy as a clam with that. Because then the Black Mage can still cast Fire 1 anytime they want to cast a fire spell. The harder thing is HP. HP only goes up when you get hit. And it's very easy to lose the curve behind that. It's very easy to get in a situation where you have too little HP, so you need to get hit. I believe only enemy attacks works, you can't attack yourself. And then either you die because the enemies are too hard, or you get hit a little bit and it only raises your HP a tiny fraction, and you just need to grind so much. 1 and 2 are extremely... 1, 2, 3, and... 1, 2, and 3 are very grindy games. Where you need to be doing the same thing over and over to improve and get better. That's not always a bad thing. I enjoy the relaxing aspect of grinding sometimes. In Pokemon, or in Final Fantasies, or various games, I don't think grinding is inherently bad. I mean... There's plenty of people who play MMOs, and those are rife with grinding. Everybody knows that. But I think that the grind in 2, because of the style of the grind, because you're not grinding fights out and optimizing efficiency in fighting enemies, instead you're grinding the specific aspects of your characters, makes it a lot harder and a lot less enjoyable, in my opinion. Especially if you're trying to grind magic, because you need to constantly go back to the town and rest. And grinding certain magics, like healing, requires you to heal, which requires you to be hurt, which just complicates things and make things unwieldy. You know, unwieldy is the best word for it. I think unwieldy is the best word I can use for that. It can make things very unwieldy. Oh, hello, friend. Games go extremely well. So, 2's from a storyline perspective is extremely dark. Like, the storyline is very lethal and very murdery towards any protagonist characters. And that's not always, like, that's not a great thing, frankly. So, would I go back in play 2? What's the good thing? The good things in 2 is showing the immediate willingness to branch out to new styles and concepts. Dragon Quest, which we discussed earlier, didn't really have any change in its core formula for a long, long time. Final Fantasy II, right out of the gate, said, hey, but what if we toss the entire job system we made out the window immediately and try something new? What if we go immediately into something weird? And they did, and I respect that. I respect the attempt. I respect the going for something new and unique, and frankly, that's something that Final Fantasy does to this day. People complain about Final Fantasy 15 and the way it handles combat. People complain about the way 14 and 11 are MMOs, which is a weird pivot on that series. People complained about 13 for very many reasons. But you have to respect that Square Enix and Final Fantasy as a series and as a franchise is constantly willing to branch out and try new concepts. That was true from the beginning, and that's true today. And I find that as a win. I find that as a good thing, something that needs to be considered and remembered. Should you play Final Fantasy II? I don't think so. I would either watch a Let's Play of it that's been edited, or watch a couple of reviews. Frankly, you're not going to be missing too much if you skip Final Fantasy II. While it is a good game and the storyline does have some interesting narrative beats, and with a shortened video you can't appreciate the weight of those beats, I think that there's too much annoyance in the game. I think there's too much annoyance in the game to really be worth going back and engaging with. That's my take, at least. Yeah, the grind isn't necessarily a bad thing. Grinding, like I said before, can be fun. It's not inherently bad. But you have to consider everything else going around on it, and is it worth your time today, in modern day, to go back and replay it? And that's where that's where I'm going to say no. That's where I'm going to say I don't necessarily think so, actually. Let me check something here. Okay, cool. Making sure my gating is good. 3 is actually the Final Fantasy that I know the least about and that I've played the least. I have played it a hot minute ago, a very long time ago. as you'd expect, I played it. Oh, geez. I played it a while back. It's not a bad game, and it's the first game that has an interchangeable job system, where you can change your job throughout the game. And I think that as becoming a staple of the Final Fantasy franchise is fantastic. I think that what it starts is great. I think that what it does is an excellent starting point for something that they fleshed out heavily in 5. That 5 fixed. They made a system that was broken, that just was not well implemented, and then later they came back and fixed. I would love to play a remake of 3. There's been many remakes of 3. And I probably should play 1 or 2 of them because it's been so long since I've played it. But I'd like to play a reimagining of 3. I'd like to play a version of Final Fantasy 3 that plays more like the Final Fantasy V's job system. It's difficult for me to remember exactly, because gameplay-wise, the actual core gameplay of Final Fantasy 3 is extremely similar to the previous ones. They're very, very similar to 1 and 2. 1 gets the pass because the combat system is completely new conceptually. The party-based RPG. 2 plays around with the core concepts of the characters. And the way that you level up and the way that you have advancements. 3, the job system is good, but... And it's an advancement over 2, I'll grant it that. I will absolutely grant it that it is an improvement over 2. I don't know. I don't know if I think it's worth going back and playing again. That's really what I'm boiling down to. Is that I don't know if it's worth going back and playing through the entire game again. You know what I'm saying? Breath of the Wild grinding is completely different because Breath of the Wild grinding is skill based. Is about engaging with enemies that you still have to pay. You're still playing the game. It's like grinding in Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter is a game that has no grinding. There's my hot take for the day. Monster Hunter is a game with no grinding. Because when you go out and fight more monsters for more parts that drop, that's not a grind. That's just playing the game. That's kind of how I feel about Breath of the Wild as well, and to a lesser extent, Pokemon. Grinding in Pokemon isn't, is grinding because you're doing the same thing over and over again against weaker enemies, trying to get to the rest of the game. Whereas if what you're doing for grinding is the game, then that's not grinding. That's just the game. But yeah, 3 does have a remake on Steam. Honestly, I think I even own it. Honestly, I think it's in my library. Hey, is that actually in my library? Final Fantasy III HD Remake. I'm going to reinstall that. Maybe I shall play that. And remind myself what it's like. Because I don't have a whole lot more takes on it. Outside of the perspective of just purely remembering what it was, I don't have a lot more takes on Final Fantasy III. So let's move on to one that I am much more intimately familiar with. 4, which came out in in actually all English countries, isn't it? Yeah, came out in all English-speaking countries as Final Fantasy II initially, because well, it was the second Final Fantasy that was released out here. Final Fantasies 2, 3, and 2 and 3 never came out. Because by the time they had localized Final Fantasy 1, they looked at the systems that were out, and the Super Nintendo was already on the market. There already was a Super Nintendo that people could buy. So they said, well, we're not going to go back and localize these, frankly, dialogue-heavy and menu-heavy games when we could just work on the ones that are going to be coming out in the future. We'll just work on the first Super Nintendo one, which makes sense. Honestly, I don't grudge in that concept at all. You're not going to localize back and then you wouldn't localize every single game that came out of a country. Nowadays, if a game comes out in Japan, you can assume that it's going to come out in North America and PAL regions within a year, right? There's very few games that are gated for longer than that, unless they're not popular, or unless they have fan translations. Both of which happen pretty often. Final Fantasy IV has some beautiful artwork, some beautiful animation. Absolutely stunning. For sprite work. Mind you, again, we're talking about, 16-bit sprite work. But sprite work is a very cool art style, a very cool and beautiful art style. And being able to make the characters emote and express is not easy, but it's something that they do very well. Adding the cutscenes, adding very dramatic cutscenes, especially in the beginning when you see a town get bombed into oblivion from an airship. It's just one of those moments where you take a step back and go, oh my gosh, this is happening, oh my goodness. Because storytelling in video games was very thin at that point. Outside of, your Super Mario worlds, where you have a whole bunch of worlds you can go through, like, how much storytelling do you have there? Now, there were games that had told stories, obviously, there were. And you're actually edging around the same time frame as North American games. Sorry, I'm just thinking about... No, was Fallout made... Where was Black Isle located? Anyways, games like Fallout were roughly... Okay, no, I was actually back in 91. Okay, so you had Might and Magic. Yeah, Might and Magic. That's what I was trying to think of. So you had the Might and Magic games that were already coming out that had very deep and engaged storylines on the PC. You had Game Boy games like Final Fantasy Adventure, which was actually just Second Densetsu 1. Just Secret of Mana 1 for the Game Boy was released as Final Fantasy Adventure because, well, the Final Fantasy branding was popular. Great game. I recommend you go play it. Seriously, Final Fantasy Adventure, Second Densetsu 1. Great game. Yeah. Where was I? Yeah. Storytelling in games was getting better. And 4 pushed the characterization and pushed that to a level that had not really been seen on console games. If you wanted to see deep, in-depth stories, then you're going to be playing Ultima on PC, or you're going to be playing Might and Magic on PC, or you're going to be playing Saga 3, which was released as Final Fantasy Legend 3 on Game Boy, which was very thin comparatively. This was an excellent storyline told well. Now, they took the concept of the job classes from Final Fantasy 3, and rather than allowing you to change the job classes, every single character is a unique individual in the world. Every character is narratively important, right? Every character is narratively important. And when a character is narratively important, you can't necessarily allow the player to change what makes them narratively important. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? It is narratively important that Cecil is a Dark Knight. That's his job. That's his Final Fantasy job class. It's narratively critical that Redea is a summoner and a black mage. It's core to her storyline. Redea's storyline, by the way, I always want to call this out. I'm going to call this blow your mind right now. Redea was supposed to be named Lydia. The classic RL Romanji to English issue that always crops up. Redea, R-Y-D-I, it's Lydia. L-Y-D-I-A, it's Lydia. Her name is Lydia. Everybody else has fairly normal names. Cecil, okay? Kane, sure. Rosa, absolutely. It's Lydia. Her name's Lydia. Okay, anyways, it's Redea because they've accepted that as the permanent answer to what the character's name is, but hot take, the character's name was supposed to be Lydia. Anyway, you can't change the character's classes because narratively Cecil must be a Dark Knight for him to complete his storyline. And when he completes his storyline, he changes from being a Dark Knight into being a Paladin. That's just how the game works. It doesn't work if you change the classes. So they did keep the concept of the class, but rather than allowing the player to change it, they locked it in and baked it into the characters. Like, yeah, you could change Kane to not be a Dragoon. But doing so detracts from his character. Him being a Dragoon, while it's not narratively important, is still core to his character's design, core to his artwork, and core to his presentation in the game world. And like I said before, Cecil becoming a Dark Knight, overcoming his Dark Knight tendencies and becoming a Paladin, spoilers I guess, is extremely important to his ability to self-actualize and overcome his own traumas. It's not that big of a spoiler, honestly, because that's, it's just a representation of his character arc. I'm not spoiling what actually goes on to make that happen, because that's what I would consider a spoiler. I'm going to try not to spoil any actual plot points in the games, so I'm not going to talk about crazy things that happen on the moon or whatnot, because that'd just be strange. So Final Fantasy IV is worth going back and playing. I genuinely think so. Maybe not as much as some of the other games in the series, but seeing where the story comes from, seeing where the story goes, it's like a book. It's like playing a book. And I mean that in a good way. I mean, I can see that, people saying, "Oh, why would I do that?" No, it's that in a good way. And no worries, Piranha. We are just talking about video games. Arakapapa. I think Final Fantasy IV is an excellent game, and I know it got a sequel. Now, there's a weird history of Final Fantasy sequels, Final Fantasy main series sequels. There's 4, which has Final Fantasy IV After Stories, I think it's called, After Years, after something, which it takes the Final Fantasy IV world and projects you into the future. I mean, even telling you over the nature of the main character might be a spoiler, actually, but takes you into the shoes of somebody who is living in the world that you have created in Final Fantasy IV. And the sequel is very similar to the original style, for better and worse. 4 is also a very difficult and very grindy game, but because you're just grinding for levels, you're not trying to fiend out specific things. The grind isn't as annoying as it was in 2, but in After Story, it feels worse. It just feels more grindy when you in that game, in my humble opinion. Final Fantasy has 15 main series games, plus sequels, plus spin-offs. Honestly, with sequels and spin-offs, you probably have to like 40 plus games. I don't know the exact count. I'm going to be talking about the main series games, and I'm going to be touching on the base sequels. Base sequels, not based sequels. Many of them I would not consider based. Maybe Crisis Core. I don't know. Anyways, Dirge of Cerberus. That's based in a way, in a very unique and weird way. It has gacked. That's all I'm looking. Look, that's all I need. I just wanted to have gacked. Everything should have gacked. Why doesn't everything have gacked? I just like gacked. That's all I want. Okay. Anyways. You know what? Since you're bringing it up, let me actually see, because I am actually going to be curious upon this. There are 95 different Final Fantasy games as of 2021. Plus 2 anime releases and 5 video releases. So yeah, there are 95 different Final Fantasy games total. Not that all these are, you know... Many of them are remakes. Well, yeah, a good chunk of them are remakes. A good chunk of them are completely different aspect stuff. Some of them are just using the Final Fantasy name. Some of them aren't Final Fantasy, but they use the Final Fantasy title anyways, like Final Fantasy Legend and Final Fantasy Adventure, which is Saga and Second Densetsu, respectively. But if you total everything up that has Final Fantasy name/branding, you're looking at 95. Which, yeah, that's a bunch. That's many, right? That's a whole lot. Yeah, we will be getting into the online ones later, trust me. So, should you go back and play 4? I think so. If you like the old school Final Fantasy style, if you've already enjoyed 5 and 6, then I would recommend going back and playing 4. But I would recommend, if you haven't played any of the old retro Final Fantasies, I wouldn't start with 6. Or I would start with 6. I would not start with 4. I would start with 6 or 5, for reasons that I'll get into when I talk about them. No, Ethan, that is including the spin-offs. That's including all. That is including the spin-offs. Yeah. 5 is a delight. 5 is a fantastic game. Final Fantasy V is, in my opinion, the high point in the series. 5 and 6 are the peak of the series for me as a player. For me as a gamer. Those are the games that I feel are optimal. Those are the games that I like the mostest. Pardon. Need more water. Ow. Final Fantasy V takes the job system that was introduced in Final Fantasy III and initiated in Final Fantasy I and tunes it to perfection. that you can change your job at any time that you're not currently in combat. Leveling up a job gives you traits and abilities that you can use on other jobs. So you actually have planning and consideration for how your team is going to look in the later aspects of the game. So you can say, hey, I'm going to take this character, I'm going to level up White Mage on them. And then I want a summoner. I will level them up as summoner. And I will give them as much White Mage as they have gained as a White Mage on their summoner class. So you have this cross combinations, like getting the dual wield ability from Ninja and taking it into the Knight class and then dual wielding greatswords. Taking the Gaia ability from Geomancer that lets you tap into the ground you're standing on for no mana and cast a spell, usually which is a damaging attack. And giving it to a Black Mage and saying, here, now you have a damaging attack that doesn't cost mana, so you can save your mana for bigger fights and still be able to engage and do damage in regular fights that aren't going to be, that otherwise I wouldn't want you to waste your mana on as we go through. And it has a ton of jobs as well. There's, what, 20 jobs in Final Fantasy V? And it sort of set the standard for jobs. It set the standard for jobs in the game. You have Knight, Monk, Thief, Blue Mage, White Mage, Black Mage, Red Mage, Time Mage, Summoner, Berserker, Mystic Knight, Mimic, Beastmaster, Geomancer, Ninja, Ranger, Bard, Dragoon, Dancer, Samurai, Chemist. 4, 9... Yeah, 20. You have 20 classes available to you. And here's the thing. Remember I said in 4 how... Reverse healing soul nuke? Nice. But remember before what I said about the classes in 4 being immutable because the characters' classes are tied into the world, are tied into the storyline? 5 has incredibly interesting characters, and their classes are not tied to the main story. You have a character who is a princess. You have a character who is a sea captain pirate. You have... Okay, no. You know, actually, let me add more adjectives. You have a character that is a sea pirate trans man in a Final Fantasy game in 1992. Let that sink in. This is coming out of Japan, which is incredibly backwards when it comes to gender shenanigans. Like, the idea of having a transgender character at all in a Japanese game is, like, kind of mind-blowing. And then doing that in the 90s is staggering. And yes, Ferris canonically uses he pronouns. They use ore, which is explicitly a male pronoun in Japanese version. That's cool. But it doesn't have relation to any particular job. There is no pirate job. There is no princess job class. Ferris can be a ranger. She can be a knight. They can be. The game does use she/her for most of it because of the translation, but regardless, they can be whatever class you want. Bart's, the main character, is a big himbo who doesn't necessarily tie to any particular class, but he can be whatever he wants to be. And then Galuf, the amnesiac, is, along for the ride. He's one of the fated characters, but he's not tied to any class. You can make your characters whatever you want them to be, and that is massive. That cannot be understated. I think that's a really good way of going about it. The storyline, as I've alluded to, is phenomenal. It is a storyline where you need to go find the 4 crystals of the elements and save the world. Except that it's not that easy, and you kind of fail. The world kind of does get destroyed, and that's not good, right? That's dangerous. The world is a dangerous place, and the storyline reflects that. It's not as savage and lethal as Final Fantasy II, but the gameplay is so much more fun, and when you're the grinding, oh my goodness. Okay, so when you're grinding for job points, because you never really need to grind for XP, frankly. When you're grinding for job points, I played Final Fantasy V recently, like within this past month recently. I played Final Fantasy V very recently because the Pixel Remaster came out on Steam, and I love it. Fantastic. It's good stuff. In Final Fantasy V, I was grinding out different job classes. I got one character with dual cast on Red Mage. If you want to grind out for the strongest spellcasting ability that lets you cast 2 spells in 1 turn, you have to max out Red Mage. Red Mage has no good magic. Red Mage doesn't get anything past a certain tier of spells. Like, you can't even cast tier 3 magic on Red Mage. And so you have to grind it out, and then when you get, like, different classes, you get to different points. I put Lena as a Mystic Knight, and even when I wasn't grinding the game, I was thinking about the grind. I was actively thinking about my party configuration, my grind, and my team composition. All things that are usually either given or you decide once and toss it out the window. I was actually thinking about the optimal way to tweak my team while I was grinding, and then going to bed and thinking about my team composition for an extra hour before I fell asleep. Like, that's a lot of mental investment in grinding. A lot of games can't pull that off. A lot of games can't make you that interested in a grind. Yeah, Red, Blue, and yeah, Blue Mage. It also introduced Blue Mage. I believe that's the first time that Final Fantasy has had a Blue Mage as well, which is a mage that lets you cast enemy abilities. Which is, I believe, actually stolen from Might and Magic, unless I'm mistaken, because because you know, Might and Magic has it. A ability that called Eagle Eye that let you give you a chance to learn a spell anytime that you saw it cast in combat. I don't know if that actually influenced the Blue Mage, but that was a thing that it was in another game system around the same era. And Final Fantasy took that and said, what if we made an entire class based around that? What if we made an entire class based around the concept that you need to watch enemies and, in Final Fantasy case, actually be hit by the attack to learn it? Which leads to a different kind of grind where you're grinding out, trying to learn new Blue Mage spells and hunting around the world for these Blue Mage spells, either because you know where they are, because a friend on the playground told you about them, or because you bought the guide. It makes grinding fun. That's hard. It's a good game. It plays well, it handles well, the characters are interesting, the storyline is interesting. Absolute delight, and all the pixel art is phenomenal. If you play the Pixel Remaster, you'll see what I mean with if you turn on the options for that. 1 second here. I want to show you the difference if I can find a quick side-by-side. The Pixel Remaster has a game option in settings that you really should find. Everybody needs to find because what it does is it emulates the effect of a CRT monitor. The pixel art is not made for a flat screen monitor. The pixel art is made to look better on a CRT. Here's an example. Hold on a second. Let me get this on screen. Where'd it go? I just saved it. Dang it. Heck, where'd it go? So, These are the same art, right? If you go pixel by pixel, this is the same artwork. There's no denying that. That's just factual. But the one on the left is on a CRT TV, well, a visual approximation thereof. It has the scan lines. It has the blur, the effect, the natural blur effect that just comes from being on a low-resolution CRT. The one on the right is crisp. It's clean. All the pixel lines are very clearly delineated, and it looks terrible compared to the one on the left. The one on the left gives you the ability to look at it and see in your mind what the artist was intending. You can see the shading on the nose. You can see some a little bit of blush line or cheekbone line here. The hair has a natural curve to it. But when you look at it just in the pixel line, it looks a lot more rigid. It looks a lot more structured. And when you look at the hair, look at this hair. You can tell what that hair is. That hair reads. That hair looks like a braid. Just glancing at this, you can see that this is a hair in a twist braid. That doesn't read on the pixel art here. Right? Like, this just sort of looks like a bulbous mass. It doesn't read, it doesn't track, it doesn't make sense. But if you go back to the originals, as they were intended to be seen, 'cause this is the original artwork as well. Keep in mind, these are both the originals. This is both the same piece. The space, exactly, the spacing, the coloration, the way it's presented, the way it's handled on the screen, and it's made for a certain type of screen. There is, and even on modern screens, the pixel art in the classic Final Fantasy games looks good. It just looks good. But hitting the button, flipping the switch that turns on the CRT mode of the game, of the world, second here, is like night and day. It changes so much. Here's an even better example. And this time I'm actually paying attention to where I download it to. This is the same image. Again, this is the exact same model sprite on the exact same background. Before we even look at the behemoth itself, I want you to look at the ground. My arrow needs to be in front of it. I want you to look at the ground. Look at this sprite work here. This looks repetitive, samey, and dull. It looks, like a dull floor. But when you actually have the CRT effects on it, you can see all of these crags, all of the detail in the ground appears in a more interesting way, in a way that is much more effective at rendering. The creature itself looks better, frankly. It looks much better. The tail actually looks like it has a glisten on it with the reflected sunlight, which doesn't track on the pixel art version. The fangs, they look recessed and dark and dangerous. This is a behemoth, by the way. Unless I'm mistaken, this is a Final Fantasy VI behemoth. Rearing up. And the pixel remaster of 5 gives you this effect, gives you this option. If you like this more, and I adore this, I think this looks much better personally. They're both phenomenal. Like, again, they are both phenomenal. But the original intention of the artwork was to look like this. And the Final Fantasy V pixel remaster, well, all the pixel remasters actually, I believe, have it, give you an exceptional look towards the to the artwork. So, would I go back and play Final Fantasy V? I literally did this month, and I loved every minute of it. Final Fantasy I, hard to justify going back and playing again. It didn't age great. Final Fantasy II aged even worse. The core mechanics of the game are not terribly fun. Final Fantasy III, it's been so long since I played it that I kind of do want to go back and play it again. Just because it's been so long since I've played it, and I remember very little about it. Final Fantasy IV, worth playing again for the story. Yeah, I'll say it. It's fine for playing for the story. Final Fantasy V, phenomenal in every way. Absolutely, Final Fantasy V is worth playing again for the story. It's worth playing again for the artwork. It's worth playing again for the mechanics, the core job system, the way you engage with the world. The music is incredible. And the music is incredible in all the games, but the Super Nintendo sound chip is much better than the classic NES one. And it really lets some of the music shine through in 4, 5, and 6. In my opinion, Final Fantasy V is the peak of Final Fantasy, right next to 6. And 6 is, in my humble opinion, the peak of Final Fantasy. 6 takes the Final Fantasy IV approach to the job system. Every character has a job that is intrinsic to who they are. But they don't have a set role. Now, here's where I want to talk about another interesting angle, I guess, is that one consistent thing in the Final Fantasy franchise is that the Final Fantasy games' narrative understanding of magic is in direct contrast to the Final Fantasy game's narrative understanding of technology. The higher the technology, the more scarce or difficult to acquire magic is. If you have a ton of technology and high technology, then magic is appearing in small little crystals that shatter if touched. If you have a weak technology, if you are in a medieval period, magic is easy to the point where many people learn it without having to have any innate understanding. Like, people will just learn magic. One day they'll learn to cast a cure spell. Like, that's just inherently native to the world because magic is just strong. But the stronger technology is, the weaker magic is. The stronger technology is, the weaker magic is. And 6 is the first game to really put this in the spotlight. We'll see it again later on, and I'll bring it up, but in 6, magic is dying. That's one of the, I would argue, that is the core plot point in 6, is that magic nobody is learning magic naturally. And nobody can learn magic through books anymore. It just doesn't work. People will pick up a book of magic and cannot read it. Like, they'll read it, but it will not teach them how to cast anything. They have no understanding of it. There's only 3 characters in the entire world that are learning magic naturally, that have a natural affinity for magic. One of them is well respected and a general in the Empire's army, and is incredibly dangerous. One of them is the result of a science experiment gone horribly, horribly right. And wrong, but kind of right, because they accomplished their goals. They forcibly infused magic into somebody, and it broke their brain, and now they're insane. They're at completely stark raving mad. And dangerous, and hate you. Oh, what a character that character is. And the third one is I can't even say protagonist, because I'll get to that in a second. The third one is the starting character of the game, Terra. And she has no memory of her past. She has a crown on her head that has stripped all of her memories away and replaced it with subservience. She has what is called a slave crown, and is effectively being mind controlled. The first plot beat of the game, where the game truly starts, is when another character is able to help her remove the crown, and she snaps back and joins in a fight against the Empire. But yeah, and nobody else can learn magic on their own. Now, I haven't really talked about the summons. Is that where your dog got your name? Yes, that is that. Yes, Terra is a reference to Final Fantasy VI. That is correct. Good night, Joreko. So, and nobody bring up Thamaso, because that is a spoiler. These summons. Now, Every Final Fantasy since 3 has had summons, I believe. 3 had summons, right? I'm pretty sure it did. It probably did. Anyways. What? You can... Yes, but I'm still going to call you Draco, because it's cute and I like it. Anyways. The Espers, or the summons, or the... whatever you want to call them, Guardian Forces, the game series has used a lot of different names for them. 6, they call them Espers. Are the only thing that can teach you magic. So in Final Fantasy VI, the only way to learn magic is to be directly taught by a summon, by Ifrit or Bahamut or one of these other, like legendary creatures, Rama. Rama is actually a main plot and important character in the game. That's the only way that you can learn magic anymore, because that's just, it just doesn't exist in the world. You can't, you cannot learn magic other than outside of direct tutelage of a creature of pure magic, and the creatures of pure magic are dying off because of their technology. I will be playing Final Fantasy VI as soon as the Pixel Remaster comes out. Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster comes out on July... Wait. Comes out... Yeah, I know it's in 2022, but give me an actual date, please. February. It'll be coming out in February. I will be doing a full playthrough of it on the channel with full voice acting. Guaranteed. I love it. It's gonna be an absolute delight. And if you like trope subversion, I know Sapphire was saying, but it breaks the save the world trope. Trust me, Final Fantasy VI has the best trope subversion, specifically of that one, that you have ever seen, and I refuse to spoil it. So I won't. But Final Fantasy VI also has no main character. One of the most interesting things in this series, and something that I wish they would come back to, is that Final Fantasy VI does not have a main character. You have an ensemble cast. Final Fantasy hasn't had an ensemble cast since 1, really. Every single character in Final Fantasy VI can be taken out of your party and ignored, outside of some major plot things early on, but after about halfway through the game, you can make your party with whoever you want. You can leave the so-called main characters out of the entire world, out of the entire gameplay, and take the party that you want to work with. And different characters have different lines, voice lines, and have different text lines in different regions, different places. Characters have different things to say in different regions. And you can decide which characters you feel most attuned to, which ones reflect you. And that's a huge, huge difference from any of the other Final Fantasy games. You could argue that Terra is the main character because she's the first person that appears on screen, and the beginning storyline revolves around her trying to get back her memory. You could argue that Locke is the main character because he probably has the most complete narrative arc and storyline, learning what changed him into who he is, and what his history was, and why he is who he is. You could make an argument that General Celis is, or even Kefka is the main character of the game, because of their ties to the Empire and their consistent ties to everything that's going on. You could make an argument that Mog, who is always in the background until before he joins your party, is a main character in the game. Like, the main character, Setzer, but yeah, Setzer by all means. Setzer can be considered a main character in the game. He has the airship. Your entire party spends a lot of time courting him and trying to earn his favor to get him to use his airship in means for the Resistance, because he initially doesn't hate the Empire. He doesn't have a big harbored grudge for the Empire. He is getting along just fine. He's doing fine for himself. And his change of heart and change of plans are pivotal to the storyline. Like, there's so many characters that are doing so many different things. And there's a Yeti. True, yeah. And characters have a soft class built in. The Yeti that Buck brings up is a berserker. You don't control the Yeti. The Yeti attacks on their own and does 1 billion damage when they hit. Sabin is a monk. You actually control him with fighting game inputs. No, really, you hit one of his commands, and you have to do a fireball motion on your joypad to do an attack. You actually have to use fighting game equivalency on your attacks, which is silly and awesome, and it works. And Mog is a geomancer. The characters have the classes baked into the characters. And that's awesome. I love it. It's a good game. It's a fantastic game. I will be playing it. Please look forward to it. I plan on playing that basically on launch day. When Final Fantasy VI comes out, I will be streaming it. Same stream schedule as usual, and full character acting on my part. And I hope that goes well. I hope that I am a good enough streamer to do that game justice to show you guys. I hope that I am a good enough streamer to do that game justice to show you guys. That's how highly I think of it. That is how highly I think of Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VII is good. Hot take alert! Final Fantasy VII is a good game, but I want to say that it's overrated. That's not the same as saying it's bad. I am not saying that Final Fantasy VII is a bad game. But I think it's overrated. I think that Final Fantasy VII is rated higher than it is not as good a game as people like to think that it is. It's a good game. It is not the best of this Final Fantasy. Like, people, I have had people say, do you think that, that Final Fantasy VII is the best RPG of all time? And my response is, it's not the best Final Fantasy. It's not the best JRPG in the Final Fantasy series. Is Sephiroth the most compelling villain, in video gaming history? Sephiroth isn't the most compelling video game villain that came out in that franchise within 3 years. Like, I just lost a bunch of viewers for this. It's fine. We got people who stay. It's a good game. It is a solid game. It did not age well. The pixel art is better in people's memories than it actually is, okay? People remember the pixel art and the polygon art is better than it actually was. Like, hold on a second here. Hold on a second. Hold on one brief moment. I'm actually going to... Oh, geez. Oh, that's why. Now, while I'm doing this, I will say that the remaster is supposed to be phenomenal. I want to play the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I don't have a PlayStation 5. I have every intention of doing it. But, yeah, the Final Fantasy VII original game... It didn't look great on launch. I'm going to be real talk, like just completely real talk with you. Final Fantasy VII didn't look that great on launch. When did that come out? 1997. Good year. I also played it on PC, just for the record. I didn't have a PlayStation. So I played Final Fantasy VII on the PC launch, which probably didn't help my opinion of it. But yeah, it came out in 97. The same year as GoldenEye. I'm not saying GoldenEye had phenomenal, graphics, but I will say that Symphony of the Night did. Symphony of the Night came out the same year as Final Fantasy VII. One of these games still looks phenomenal to this day. It's not Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII came out the same year as The Curse of Monkey Island. Yo, have you guys seen The Curse of Monkey Island? Have you seen how hard that game goes on the 2D art? Like, seriously, have you? Hold up. We're gonna do a quick tangent about, because the art is all hand-drawn classic animation. This is the kind of thing I can't actually have prepared because I didn't know I was going to go on this tangent. Yo, look at this actual in-game footage. Like, this is a hand-drawn background with hand-drawn characters and hand-drawn animation. Classic animation. This is just good. This is old, this is LucasArts. This is phenomenal. This was still LucasArts, right? Yeah, LucasArts was still around then. This is just incredibly well drawn. Hi, I'm over here. It's beautiful. Fantastic game, do recommend. This came out the same year as Final Fantasy VII. I really need to get a good art. Oh well. Yeah, rest in peace, LucasArts. Real talk. One of the best. So, Final Fantasy VII is a very good game. I am not slamming Final Fantasy VII, despite what my viewer count would imply. I find it hilarious that I've lost half my viewers since I started the Final Fantasy VII section. That's genuinely hilarious to me. But yeah. 7, Bill Guasarme is correct. It's the first one for so many people. And it is one of the first games of its era to have as much spectacle as it did. It is a very shiny thing. It is a very pretty game, and I do respect it. The storyline is a little contrived, and it does something that I will never forgive it for. Final Fantasy VII starts a trend in Final Fantasy games to be about one character. Do you remember what I was saying about an ensemble cast? Do you remember what I was saying just a little while ago about Final Fantasy VI having an ensemble cast? That's gone. That dies here. That entire beautiful concept that works so well in 6 dies on 7. 7 starts a trend that stays around for the next... for the disc, not counting the MMOs, it stays around for, more or less the rest of the franchise, where there is one central character in the party. Final Fantasy 1, who's the main character? Any of the main 4. They're interchangeable. They're completely interchangeable. Final Fantasy 2, who's the main character? You have a party of 4. They're all equally, characterized. Final Fantasy 3, who's the main character? I guess Arc, but honestly, anybody in that party is on the same team working together. It's about the teamwork that they have and about the journeys that they go through. Final Fantasy 4, who's the main character? Yeah, it is Cecil. I mean, I can't really deny that, but it's still about the team and the entire group more so than just only being Cecil's story. It's not exclusively Cecil's story. I mean, Final Fantasy 5. All 4 main characters are equally important. Genuinely. Even the amnesiac Galuf comes in much later in the game and learns about his past and learns about his heritage and is as interesting and compelling a character as anyone else. All the characters in 5 are interesting and are the main characters. Who's the main character in 6? It doesn't have one. The main 6 is about the storyline and the narrative of the team and the concept. Yeah, Bartz does not get a backstory until 2/3 of the way through Final Fantasy V. You don't know who he is other than that he's a really nice guy who helps out people. And then what turns out his backstory is that he's a really nice guy who helps people. Like, it doesn't have his back. You find his town, you find out some history about his family, but honestly, it doesn't really change anything about his character. He's just a really nice guy who helps people. And then in 7, it's the Cloud story starring Cloud and Cloud. It's No, I did not misspeak there. That's exactly what I intended to say. If you played Final Fantasy VII, you know what I mean. Final Fantasy VII is the Cloud story starring Cloud. It's the Cloud story starring Cloud Strife and Cloud Strife's friends that include Cloud Strife. Nothing in Final Fantasy VII is about anybody but Cloud and possibly Aeris at various points until it no longer becomes about Aeris and it becomes about Cloud again. After you leave Midgar, for all intents and purposes, both Tifa and Barrett's storylines are complete. Like, there's a notch later on that cleans things up, but like, once you get out of Midgar, their storylines are done. Other characters come in, have a bit of story, and then leave, but you can't even take Cloud out of your party, and everybody else is interchangeable. Non-metaphor, that's not a metaphor. Everybody else is literally interchangeable. And I don't like that. It's what they're going for, and it's the way they want to tell the story, and it's the story that they intend to tell. So I can't, like, hate on it too much. I still have to respect for it, but yeah, I don't like that, and it taints the Final Fantasy series for the next couple of games. As far as the game itself goes, it's fine. It's a good game. It's a rock-solid game. Final Fantasy VII, Midgar's part, the part where you are in the city, takes a really long time to get through. Then you get out of the city, and the game feels like it opens up, and you feel less constrained. You feel less confined, and you feel more like you're more free to do what you want. But that doesn't mean the city part's bad, because that's what they want. You wouldn't feel free. You wouldn't have freedom that you have once you get to the overworld if you didn't spend the entirety of Disc 1 in Midgar. The feeling of relief and emptiness and openness and opportunity that you get for leaving Midgar required you to be in Midgar for as long as you did. Narratively, I think it's perfectly fine that that level of catharsis and relief is resolved when it is. Storyline-wise, it's good. It gets a bit convoluted, and convoluted for a Final Fantasy game at that. That's the thing. It's convoluted for a Final Fantasy game, and that's saying a lot, frankly, right? Like that's not a light comment. Final Fantasy VII story gets fairly convoluted, and it does work well on the trope of the unreliable narrator. I love the concept of the unreliable narrator. The idea that somebody is saying something and you don't necessarily have to believe them, or they are intentionally lying to you. Because it's so often in a book or a story or a video game that if somebody says something, they're truthful. Like, yeah, if they say something, it's because they're saying something. They're saying something that's just true, right? It's super rare for a character to lie to you in a video game. Especially a quest giver, especially a main character. In Final Fantasy VII, using the unreliable narrator as a trope, I think works extremely well for it. It also has a fantastic plot twist partway through the game. So yeah, would I go back and play Final Fantasy VII? I would play the remake. Final Fantasy VII Remake looks so much better than what Final Fantasy VII actually was. And everything I've seen about the remake looks like they are taking the personalities of the characters that are implied and fleshing it out in a very full force way. It takes the personalities of the characters and gives them enough to work with, if you will. It gives them enough to work with. The characters act in a way that's consistent with how I remember them acting in the old game, in the game. And that's not easy, right? That's an incredible talent for both voice acting and animation. So I would not go back and play the base Final Fantasy VII again. I really wouldn't. If I play Final Fantasy VII again, and I have every intention to, it will be Final Fantasy VII Remake. Because I think that's one of those rare cases where the remake completely superannuates the original despite being a very, very different game. And that's not always the case. That's very often not the case. I mean, heck, look at Seiken Densetsu. The remakes are worse than the original. I can't think of any of the Legend of Mana games that are better than Final Fantasy Adventure. Like, it just Seiken Densetsu 1 is just the better game, frankly. It just is. It's just good. And I'm not counting things like the Pixel Remaster of 5 or the remake or like the Origins make of Final Fantasy 1, because those are the same game, just, rebuilt. Final Fantasy 7 is completely reimagined with new combat, new cutscenes, new storyline beats, new art. It reconceptualizes everything, which is the bar that I'm putting under here. This is the tier of scrutiny that I'm applying to it. Does that make sense? Okay. So no, I would not play Final Fantasy VII again because the remake exists. And the remake is not out yet. And I was planning on waiting until the remake is completed until I play it. But as of right now, yes, the remake only covers Disc 1. Which is fine. I mean, they're putting so much work and so much effort into it, and honestly, their new version of Disc 1 is a full game's worth of content. Like, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that's like any sort of like cheapening thing. I just like to wait until games are completed to play them, I plan on playing Deltarune as soon as the storyline is complete. I plan on playing Final Fantasy VII when all the parts have come out. And I'm excited for both. I genuinely want to, but I don't want to cliffhanger myself, I don't want to cliffhanger myself until it's done. So, yeah, I will play Final Fantasy VII again, but not the original. The original didn't age great with the artwork and the animation. And some of the lines are a little bit sketch nowadays, I'm not gonna lie. They drop a couple of R words in there as well. A little bit uncomfy at times. Final Fantasy VIII. Do you remember what I said before about the existence of technology and the way it counterpoints the existence of magic? In Final Fantasy VI, magic is only available when it's taught by these by the Espers. It's only available when it's taught directly by these masters of pure magic. In Final Fantasy VII, magic is so far gone, all that's left are little chips and shards that you can use as a focus to cast spells. The materia system, don't forget that materia is all that's left of magic. Yeah, anybody can use magic, but you pick up a chunk of materia and that's all that's left of magic. You can't cast magic, the materia casts the magic for you. Oh yeah, real quick on 7. I just want to mention that there's no classes. No character is better at anything than any other character, functionally. And this is a trend that continues into 8. And I don't like that either. The difference between two characters is just a couple of stat points, which can be rearranged by changing the materias. I wish that weren't the case. But in Final Fantasy VII, there's no functional difference between the characters. Anybody's a black mage if you give them enough offensive materia. Anybody is a dragoon if you give them the jump materia. Anybody's a thief if you give them the steal and mug materia. There's nothing that makes Yuffie a better thief than Cloud. There's a few, you could consider Barret a ranger because he can be in the back row, I guess. You consider, Tifa a monk because she uses fist weapons, but functionally that doesn't make anything difference, Tifa doesn't have any of the other hallmarks of a monk. Anybody can equip counter. Anybody can equip a chakra. Anybody can equip there's no other monk traits aside from massive HP, but anybody can equip HP up. There's nothing inherent to the characters that make them a class. Unlike 6, unlike 6 where and 4 where the characters are a class. Like, yeah, it's easy to say that Cid is a dragoon and Tifa's a monk, but what does it mean to be a monk? Does it mean you just attack things and do damage? Everybody does that. Does it mean that you do massive damage when unarmed? Well, you don't actually. She doesn't do any significantly more damage than anybody else if they have the appropriate weapon. And she can't be truly unarmed. She has to have a weapon equipped. Her weapons are unarmed combat weapons. That's something that started in 6 actually with Sabin, but Sabin could still hit like a truck when he was completely unarmed too. So yeah, the class system is out the window, just gone, and it is missed. That's one thing that I don't like about 7, and that's something that continues into 8, because in 8, Final Fantasy 8. No, let me and, these dovetail together. So these, I'm going to talk about them both at the same time. In Final Fantasy VIII, magic is transient. Magic is shattered. Technology is so high tier, technology is so established, that there is no such thing as a permanency of magic. The entire concept of a permanency of magic is gone from the world. All you have left for magic and the ability to cast it is a temporary ability to draw magic out of certain points in the ground and out of certain enemies, and then temporarily store it until you cast it. And then these also affect your stats, because you can junction a system which is much maligned and frankly deserves much of its maligning. The junction system lets you tie your magic to your stats. So if you have fire, you can tie that to your strength to give yourself a strength boost. If you have water, you could tie water to your magic to gain an MP boost. You could tie fire to your magic, but it won't give you as much an effect as something that's an appropriate element. And this creates a major gameplay problem. You are directly encouraged. Let me shimmy. There, that's a little bit better lighting. Sorry. You are directly encouraged to grind in one of the most unfun ways in Final Fantasy. If I have one cast of Fire 3, then cool. I can cast Fire 3 once. That does nothing. If I have 65 casts of Fire 3, well, now I can junction that to Strength and hit really hard. And then I don't want to cast it because then every time I cast it, I'm lowering my Strength. It encourages you to do exactly as Buck says. It encourages you to never cast spells. It encourages you to stockpile. It encourages you to grind in an unfun way. And that's a shame, because the core concept of it works in the context of Final Fantasy. In the context of Final Fantasy, that I think works extremely well. There are 2 spells you can cast: Meltdown and Aura. Yeah, without getting into... Yeah. I think that's a bad thing. But it also follows Final Fantasy VII's trend where all the characters are completely interchangeable. Nobody does anything interesting. No one. Not a single character in Final Fantasy VIII has a mechanical benefit that is interesting, with the exception of Squall's gun sword that lets you do a little bit of extra damage if you play a mini-game when you attack. It's the same mini-game as Super Mario RPG, where you hit a button at the moment of attack. Which is actually great. I actually do like that concept. I actually think that's a really engaging way of making a thing. Quistis is not a blue mage because she cannot cast blue magic outside of her limit. Only during limit breaks are the characters interesting. Outside of limit breaks, the characters are not classed at all. What is, just doesn't exist. There isn't anything about Quistis that is a blue mage, except for once every 8 fights? 9? Every multiple times a fight when you hit endgame, but like by then it's a completely different scenario. It's just so it's a shame, because that characterization would have been strong if they went with it. But instead, all the characters are interchangeable. Now, from a storyline perspective, I have a hot take. I have a nuclear take on the Final Fantasy VIII storyline. A lot of people say that it should have ended a disc earlier. A lot of people say they need to cut the storyline earlier and get it done and end it before things got super weird. I think the opposite. I think that Final Fantasy VIII needed an extra disc. I think that Final Fantasy VIII needed an entire extra disc of content to flesh out the story, to flesh out everything that's going on. I need to be able to explain some of the weird stuff that happens endgame. It didn't need to be cut. It needed to be elaborated on and brought to light. Final Fantasy VIII probably has the most convoluted story, but it has the most convoluted story because they don't explain things well, not because it's really deep, yo. I don't think it's the travesty that many other people do. I don't think it's the worst game, in the world. I'd be tempted to cite it as the worst game in the series, if not for 2, but I think that 2's honestly just really gets under my skin for its mechanical, for its game, from a game design perspective, which, you know, you guys know I rate that fairly highly. I think that Final Fantasy VIII is a decent game. It has phenomenal music. I will absolutely praise the music. The music in Final Fantasy VIII is some of the best in the entire series. So go look up a playlist of Final Fantasy VIII's music. Uematsu goes hard. He absolutely just goes full tilt into his compositions at every single point. There is not a bad track on that entire OST. And the ones that are good are just phenomenal. I will never not pop off at So You're a Lion. I think what's the other song actually called? Maybe I'm a Lion. Yeah, it does also have a part where the moon gets too full. It has to end. Monsters have to come to Earth from the moon. But but sometimes it gets silly. But there's also silly moments in the game too. I think that 8 is underrated, but that's different from saying that it's good. Keep that in mind. The same as 7. 7 is overrated, but that doesn't mean it's bad. 8 is underrated, but that does not mean that it's a good game. You know, that doesn't mean that it's great. The nonsense works to an extent, but you have to be on board for it. Like, if you go on into 8 expecting a coherent storyline, you will be sad. It just does not do that thing that you want it to do. I hate to tell you this, but the game is silly. The game is in fact actually silly. 9 I love. I really do love 9. The graphics are great. The graphics are so good that it's very easy to forget that it is a PlayStation 1 game. Final Fantasy IX is a PlayStation 1 game. It has PlayStation 2 graphics, frankly. I think the main characters are interesting. The storyline works, and the moments that people tend to hate are important for narrative purposes. A lot of people dislike the fact that your white mage becomes mute partway through the series, narratively. I mean, I guess this is a minor spoiler. I won't spoil why. All I will say is that it's because of trauma, and it's because of something that she needs to work through emotionally before she can feel comfortable with both her magical ability and her ability to participate. And people go, oh man, my white mage stinks now. Well, yeah, that's kind of what you're supposed to be feeling. You're supposed to be feeling that way because the other characters care about her, but also recognize that at the moment she is a burden. But they care about her enough to stay with her even though she's a burden right now. Like, that's the point. That's the plot. That's the storyline. That's the entire storyline of Final Fantasy IX, is this moment of this character is a burden. But that's okay, because we care about her, and it's gonna be okay. Like, that's the genuine storyline. Of the game, and it works. Final Fantasy IX works because of that. That's usually what people bring up when they say they dislike 9. But the characterizations are good. There's only one character that I think is really poorly handled. Cheers, Safi. Good luck. The overall storyline, I think, works well too. It's also a much more medieval period where magic is more real, and it goes back to the class-based system where every character has a very clearly defined class, like Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI. And that class is intrinsic to the character and their moment-to-moment actions, as opposed to, 7 and 8, where the characters are functionally completely interchangeable. The mechanics of the system were actually... Fun fact, I actually called the system mechanics before it came out. I actually called the system mechanics, and I wonder if I could ever... The thread, there's no way the thread exists. There's no way that thread exists anymore. No, not a chance. I actually called out that the next magic system was going to be gear-based, and you would learn skills and traits based on your equipment before the game came out, and that's exactly what the game does. Magic is well pervasive in the world, and they make equipment interesting. See, in every other Final Fantasy game, you equip whatever has the highest stats. If something hits harder, you equip the thing that hits harder. Duh. If something gives you more protection, you equip the things that gives you more protection. Sure. You make some shifts, if you will, here and there, because you want to make sure that your elements work. You don't want to be hitting a wind elemental with a wind attack, but aside from that, you just go with whatever has the highest attack. In Final Fantasy IX, weapons teach you skills, and passive traits as well. Learning these passive skills and traits actually becomes very important, and when you get a new weapon, you don't immediately equip it. You actually have to ask yourself, am I gaining skills and traits that I need? Should I keep my old weapon equipped? Should I keep my old weapon equipped for now so I can finish skilling up this ability, or is another new weapon good enough that I should equip it now and worry about the ability later? Or maybe I don't need that ability, or XYZ. You have options. You have a very interesting and engaging equipment system that's not just equip the best item. This actually is brought back. This system is brought back for Final Fantasy VII Remake. For Final Fantasy VII Remake! They use the Final Fantasy IX equipment system, where you go back and except that in 7 it's actually permanently tied to the weapon, so the weapons just function completely different. But still, in general, the idea of tying abilities to the weapon and playstyles is something they brought back for Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I've heard no one complain about. Despite hearing many people complaining about it in Final Fantasy IX, no one's complaining about it in Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's almost like people are being disingenuous with their criticisms. Weird. Anyways. The storyline in 9 is what sells the game. 8's storyline is silly and doesn't go many places. 7's storyline is only there to service Cloud. 7's storyline is there to service one character and to make sure one character's spotlight feels earned. I'd be there. Yeah. Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 focus on the storyline. 9 focuses on the storyline too. 9 is very much a callback to the classic Final Fantasy games, which were already classic at that time. And it handles all of these things very well, in my humble opinion. Oh yeah, I didn't add my would I go back and play for Final Fantasy 8. The answer is no. Okay, so anyways. I'll play 8 when it gets a remake that improves mostly the junction system. If they redo a remake that changes the junction system out to be something that's engaging, I'll play it. Final Fantasy 9, I would go back and replay. I don't know if I'll do that right now, but it's a game that I enjoyed enough that I would willingly go back and replay it. And I feel like I should. I feel like I enjoyed the game enough to do that, which is no small accomplishment, right? There's a couple of duds. There's 2 characters that the game would be better without. There's some combat sequences that just drag on. There's 1 or 2 twists in the late game that just don't feel earned. And the game forces you to do a relatively tedious and somewhat luck-based minigame that is required for progression. The game has its problems. It's not perfect. But I think it is a very good game. And honestly, I can't ask it for much more than that. Final Fantasy X. I want to start with one thing here. I'm going to just make one thing perfectly clear for everybody watching. Final Fantasy X is not a story where Tidus is the main character. Tidus is the point of view character, and Tidus is the first character you meet, and Tidus is the main character. It appears to be the main character for most of the game. And I wasn't really vibing with it. I was just like, yeah, whatever. I don't like this guy. I don't care much about it. It wasn't until I realized something that I should have realized from the artwork. Tidus is not the main character of Final Fantasy X. The main character of Final Fantasy X is Yuna. And they make that clear way too late, frankly, into the series, into the game, into the production. It appears as though Tidus is the main character, but there's one point where Tidus says, "This is my story," and Yuna says, "No, this is my story." And I put down the controller and recontextualize everything that happened. Because she's right. It's Yuna's story. And once I realized that, I liked it a lot more. And, oh, Eric, what did I think of the laugh scene? I'll tell you what I thought of the laugh scene. I will gladly tell you that. Because it's phenomenal. And people take it so far out of context that it makes me angry. Okay. I want to remind you, because many people who have played Final Fantasy X forget, that a character just died in that scene, before that scene. A character who was friend to all the other characters in the main cast, and somebody who Yuna knew growing up, was killed. And Tidus's comment before the laugh scene is, "Hey, we need to, he's trying to cheer up somebody who just had someone that they care about, someone that they're compassionate for, murdered." And he's saying, we need to laugh. We need to, buck up, cheer up. We need to keep going. And she looks at him and says, "What are you talking about?" Like, I don't remember the exact dialogue, but, one second here. And yeah, Yuna thinks her entire quest is functionally worthless at that point. "Summers and their guardians are kind of like Spira's ray of light. A lot of people in Spira depend on us. I learned to practice smiling when I'm feeling sad." I know, it's hard. They're trying to smile when they're feeling sad. They're trying to laugh their way through a moment of pain and sorrow. And Tidus's laugh, yeah, it sounds strained, it sounds forced, it sounds fake. That's the point! The entire point of the scene is that Tidus feels obligated to laugh when he feels pain and sorrow and is trying to force laughter. The entire point of the voice acting of that scene, the entire point of the voice acting for that scene, every single line note that I assume exists in that scene is the characters are trying to laugh even though they're in great emotional distress. Guess what? It sells that. It does. It's good. The characters are laughing in a way that feels fake and strained and absolutely unrealistic and unreasonable because that's what they're actually doing. They are laughing in a way because the characters don't feel joy. They're trying to laugh to show the world a front, a face. They're trying to put on a mask of happiness. And failing. And when Tidus laughs, you can see him fail. And that's okay. You can see him fail to put on a good face and smile and just buck up and get through it, laddie. Like, just trying to, to become that. Like, no, he can't do that. It's not reasonable to expect him to do that. And he fails and laughs like, because, yeah, that's his failure to do what he's trying to tell somebody else to do. And then you play out the laugh, play out to the end of the scene, and see them actually start to laugh at the absurdity of what they're doing. Have them, at the end of the scene, they're actually kind of chuckling at the sheer absurdity of the idea that they would laugh at this moment. They actually are laughing because of the absurdity of their own failure to laugh. Is it a silly scene? Yeah. Is it a bad voice acting moment? I don't think so. I genuinely don't think so. I genuinely think that they accomplish what they're trying to do there. Like... yeah. Pardon. At that moment, I think that the awkward and goofy laugh is not only intentional, but works correctly in the context of the scene. Okay, that was a lot of words about one exact scene, but everybody knows that scene, and I think that that's something that's been on my chest for like forever. In summary, yeah, it sounds like it's a fake laugh because it's supposed to sound like it's a fake laugh, and it works. Would the game have been better without Titus as the main playable character? I don't think so, because that moment of recontextualization worked so well that I feel that it was both intentional and effective. If it had been Yuna's story from the start, I wouldn't have had that moment of going, "Oh, this is Yuna's story." If I didn't know it from the start, if I knew from the start that it was Yuna's story, I wouldn't have that moment of recontextualization. So I think that it works well. I think it could have been handled better earlier on the game. I think that it could have been presented a little bit sooner. I don't know that I would have engaged in all of the narrative beats around it, but I think that the actual way it paths out, I think works. Mechanically, I like the fact that 10 goes back to an actual turn-based. Now, 6, 7, 8, and 9. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 all use a pseudo real-time system. And 10 actually goes back to a true turn-based, which I actually liked. I actually really liked that aspect of it. I think that went very well, and I wish... I don't know. I think that it worked well. I would like more proper turn-based activity out of it, but... C'est la vie. I think that 10 is a good game, and it's probably one of the most Final Fantasy out of the entire Fantasy series. If you want to pick up the series with a game, I would recommend 6 or 10. The biggest complaint I have about 10 is that it's too linear. Like, the game is extraordinarily linear, especially compared to the other titles. 1 is not linear enough. I mean, you can only go in one direction, but it's not clear what that direction is. 2 is fine. 3 and 4 are both fine. 5 gives you a little bit more freedom and flexibility to go where you want, and but the dead ends out pretty quickly. 6 gives you a lot of almost too much flexibility. 6, you can skip the entire second half of the game. The entire second half of the game in 6 is optional. I mean, you need to do it to get levels to get to the end boss, but you can quite literally go to the end boss at what should be the halfway mark through your playthrough. But in terms of, like, you know, 10 is playing a book. Final Fantasy X is playing through a book. Whether or not that's a good thing to you is entirely up to you. But you have less agency in Final Fantasy X compared to many of the other games. You don't have agency over your stat lines like you do in 8. You don't have agency over your build like you do in 7. You don't have agency over your job system like you do in 5 and 3. You don't have a lot of agency over the mechanics in 10 outside of the sphere grid. And let's be honest, there's not a lot of functional agency in the sphere grid either. You go in a direction and you pick up the things on the way to your better abilities. There's not, unless you do something super weird like I did with Kimari. When I played Final Fantasy X, I stuck Kimari behind a level 3 lock gate for like 20 hours of gameplay, and then when I finally got a level 3 unlock gem, he had so many levels he went completely into the high level deep scaling parts of different characters' trees. It was kind of ridiculous. Actually, it was a lot of fun. It made him completely overpowered. Anyways, Final Fantasy X is on the whole a good game, and I think I would replay it. And I know I haven't been talking about spin-off games, but here I'm going to touch on 10-2 because I'm actually playing through 10-2 right now. Like, that's actually one of the games I play when I'm not streaming right now. It's a good game. I mean, it takes the job system back in a weird way. Level lock. The sphere grid in Final Fantasy X is a grid-based leveling system where you would need to follow certain paths, and yeah, you don't. It's not a hard cap. I could have gone on and leveled up in another direction, but I couldn't have gone through a certain gate. I couldn't have gone through a certain area until I got an item that allowed me to through. Think of the leveling tree like a dungeon, right? There was a door that I couldn't pass through, and instead of going in the other direction and getting all of the levels in that direction, I chose not to level him up for many gameplay hours, and chose to instead wait until I could open a door so that I could go through that door and dump all of my levels at once in a different direction. And in the end, he had Yuna's absurd late game magic ability and Yuna's late game magic ability and Lulu's late game spells. So he was just an absolute behemoth. But yeah, I would play through 10 again, frankly. I think that it's a good game. I recommend it. It's very linear. It's the most like playing through a book or a miniseries. It's like playing through a 4-season-long anime series, if you will. And that's not a bad thing inherently. It has less... I could make the argument that it has less gameplay because you have less agency over the storyline compared to many of the other games. But I don't know if that's being fair because it's not supposed to. You know, it's not supposed to have that. Be right back 1 moment. Okay, so I did an entire 2-hour stream talking about Final Fantasy XI. I should put a card up there, in there. I probably won't. I won't remember. Just being honest. I did an entire 2-hour stream about Final Fantasy XI on it, and if you want my full in-depth details on the game, go watch that. It's honestly, I think it went well. I think it was a good stream, and it's one of my 3D streams. I was thinking about doing this one in 3D since I don't really have a whole lot of sources to need to pull up, but I just wasn't in the mood to pull out my headset, frankly. That's why I decided to do this in here. So, Final Fantasy XI, I think, is the most underrated game in the series. A lot of people ignored it because it's an MMO. And yeah, fair. Honestly, I get it. It's an MMO, and it's an old school MMO too. This is back in the... This is less like World of Warcraft and more like Ultima. It's an MMO where you need a team. Or at least you did, until more recent patches made it so that you don't, and you can do things solo. But initially, you needed to have a team of friends to play with you to accomplish anything, or you need to be able to meet people and talk to them. And I don't mean it like a friends in the Final Fantasy XIV sense, where you can meet somebody and go through a dungeon with them. I mean you actually had to communicate with people, talk with them, organize a party, set up things. You had to actually do teamwork things. You had to actually have a team and have teamwork, and that, frankly, is phenomenal if you have the willingness to find the group, or if you play the game nowadays where you don't need it as much. Now you can do the game with just 1 or 2 other people. Before, you need a full team of 6 to accomplish any storyline stuff. It's a good game, and honestly, it has one of the best storylines. The Promethea storyline, which is the second which is the second expansion, or the first expansion that was released in North America, is honestly one of Square Enix's best storylines. It genuinely is one of Square Enix's best storylines. And it's one that does not translate well to video. I hate to say it, I wish it did. But Final Fantasy XI's storyline does not translate into watching videos of the story. Because you need to exist in the game world to understand it. Like, a narrative walkthrough won't include you walking through the towns, or finding your way to the regions, or the tension in some of the more difficult boss battles. It just, you can't capture that in a YouTube video that shows the storyline. But it's good. Final Fantasy XI's storyline is honestly fantastic. The gameplay I like, but I like that. Yeah, if you want the full thoughts on the gameplay and everything he does right and wrong and everything in between, I would recommend that. Yeah, I would recommend watching my full thoughts on it in the other stream. There's a special heck in finding an MMO whose gameplay and story you enjoy only to realize you're too horrified with interacting people to build a team. And a lot of people hit that same wall. Because if you don't have a team, it's difficult to do things in 11. And it's difficult to have fun. Like, the game is based on working together and teamwork. And it sells that in a way that other MMOs don't. Other MMOs don't require as much teamwork or as much focus as 11. And I think that's... I don't know, like... I understand why a lot of people wouldn't play it. But at the same time, I think it's a shame, because the game is very good. Because of that teamwork. Because of the sense of accomplishment for beating some of the more difficult situations. It's a good game not in spite of being an MMO. It's a good game because of what it forces you to do. Now, there's also the downsides of it. Like, I'm not saying it's good to have to wait until Japanese midnight to get to the next storyline beat. Like, no, that stinks. But existing in the world and seeing the progression of the story and the narrative play out is huge. I will say, though, if you do have one or two other friends, you can play 11 fine. Nowadays, in 11, they have added a, what I think it's called the trust system, where you can summon NPCs that you've made friends with in the storyline, and you start out the game with one or two of them, to help you in your party, to help fill holes in your party. So you can actually do a full party of 6 with 2 people, and use the trust system to summon a couple of the NPCs to be a part of your party. It's like you can have 2 people of any 2 jobs, and then summon Prince Trion to tank for you, or summon Kupipi to heal for you, or so on. Like, nowadays, it would actually be very easy to get back into 11 if you had just one other person with you, and 2 other people with you. You could do basically all the content, all the storyline content in the game. Hello, Ripley. You missed Final Fantasies 1 through 10. So yeah, I think 11 is a very good game, and it's a shame that many people will never play it. I understand why, I get it, but it makes me sad because of how much good content and how much very interesting narrative beats. And again, it's hard to explain why, but I have watched some of the cutscenes in on YouTube, and they just do not sell what's going on. They don't sell it in the way that experiencing it in game does. Some games you can do that too. Like Final Fantasy X, you could probably get away with watching the movie version of the story, but Final Fantasy XI, it just does not work. Same with 6, honestly. Be existing in the world and moving around it and exploring adds so much to the storyline, the actual functional storyline of the game, that you can't really experience the game without it. Honestly, a Let's Play would probably be fine, but like, I don't think anyone would really care about a Let's Play of Final Fantasy XI. Flood the comments if I'm wrong on that one. So Final Fantasy XII and I have an interesting relationship. I got Final Fantasy XII on launch day. I got it at a midnight release. A special edition box that's actually right over there right now. I didn't play it for like 4 years. And this wasn't a I don't want to open the box and decrease the value sort of thing either. This was just because much of the gameplay actually feels like Final Fantasy XI, except not handled as well. A lot of the core gameplay has this overworld feel and this weapon delay style combat with various actions you can do, except that you don't really... Except that your control over your party is weird. You can actually code them with a pseudocode AI system, which is a cool concept, but then you... I don't know, it's strange, because it felt enough like 11 to me that whenever I was playing 12, I said, oh, this is kind of neat. Or I could just go play more 11. And I ended up not playing 12 until I actually got it on Steam with the Zodiac Age expansion, which apparently fixes a lot of things about it. It's an interesting game. It's a good game. And it does something that crops up again later as well, where it sort of cribs into the Final Fantasy Tactics category. I'm not going to be talking about Final Fantasy Tactics today, because I've never played it. I've never played Tactics. I've never played Final Fantasy Tactics. Nope, never played it. I know the game. I played like an hour of Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced. It's not the same game. People keep telling me that. People keep telling me that, no, don't play Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced. Too late. I've already played it. I've never played Final Fantasy Tactics. Come at me. I don't know. Anyways, this takes place in the same world as Final Fantasy Tactics, apparently. The characters are good. The artwork is good. The combat is fine. Once you get into the combat, it gets a lot better. But I had a strange learning curve with the combat. I didn't enjoy it much to start, but as I got more into it, and as I got more abilities, and as I got more AI pieces, because you can't code because you can code the allies with AI, but you have to buy the pieces of the AI and put them together like a visual scripting code. Like, you actually have to buy the at 30% health, or when less than 30% health tile. And then once you buy it, you can attach it to a character. So, at less than 30% health, cast Cure. But you can't do that if you don't have the tile. So you have to buy the AI components for your own team. And that's weird, right? Like, it's weird, and I don't know if I like it. It's strange, and I don't know. Narratively, it's pretty good. I like this base storyline. And the characters are very interesting. Bosch is the best main character. He's fantastic. Tall, bunny girl, strong, good. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's a good game. I recommend it. Would I play it again? I don't think I would in the near future. Oh yeah, would I play 11 again? Yes. Yeah, I genuinely would. I enjoyed it. Even if I started from scratch, I would play 11 again. I actually have played 11 again from scratch and gotten a little ways through it. But I could see myself doing that. 12, I don't know if I would. I don't know. I think that 12 is a game... I mean, it already has a remake. The Zodiac Age remake changes much of the core mechanics of the game. The core level up system, frankly. And it much for the better. You decide on a character for your game, and it works really well. I don't know that I would go through and play the game again. At least not without getting a Final Fantasy VII Remake style treatment. And that's fine, of course. That's totally reasonable. But I enjoyed my time playing it. I'm glad I played it. I'm glad I went back and played it after having not played it for so long, and it was a good experience. But I don't know that I would jump on board to play that again. It's not like a game like, Final Fantasy V or VI, where I might replay it every couple years just to experience it again. I wouldn't jump on board all the time with it and just, you know, keep up with it. But I would play it again at some point if it got a update or treatment that even something simple like unlocking all the AI tiles to begin with would be enough, honestly. I have not played Final Fantasy 13. This is the only main series Final Fantasy game that I have never played. I have not played Final Fantasy 13. There is my shame. There it is. I intend to. It's on my list, but I just never really got it around. I don't like the setting, is really what it boils down to. The characters, I played like an hour or so of it, maybe 2. Only one character actually seemed interesting, and his name was Saz, and he was actually pretty cool. Everybody else just seemed very droll. It just doesn't catch my attention. The storyline, the aesthetic, even the combat system just feel not for me. And it's hard to explain why. And especially when I've liked so many of the other games, and this is very similar to so many of them. So I don't have a lot of input to say about 13. Unfortunately. I mean, you know, after how much time I've talked on everything other one, I just genuinely don't have a lot of input. The most I can say here is that the game seems like it might be okay. I've heard that the sequels get better and better. Final Fantasy 13, 2, and 3 are supposed to be okay and great, respectively. And I kind of want to experience that. I kind of do want to experience through that and see what it is, see what it's like, see what I can get out of it. And maybe I will. I don't know. I haven't decided. But the initial start of it, there was only one cool character, and his name was Saz, and he has an afro, and he has a baby chocobo in his afro, and that was just really interesting and cool and endearing, and he's the only character that actually acted like a person. He's the only character that actually acted like a person. Who actually looked at the situation and said, what are we doing here? Who actually looked at a mission and said, no, we shouldn't do this. This is ridiculous. If we do this, we're putting ourselves in danger. He was the only voice of reason in a cast of people who have no reason. Everybody else felt so forced, so blank slate. And Lightning herself just felt incredibly generic. And I've heard that changes. I've heard that that gets better partway through, and maybe it is like a Final Fantasy X thing where there's going to be a big recontextualizing moment that's going to make me appreciate that the rest of the game. Maybe there is a Final Fantasy VI moment where the entire game shifts and the focus of everything changes so that you need to relearn how the world works. Maybe there's a lot going on in the late game that I need to get to appreciate, but I haven't gotten there. And I don't know if I will. I mean, I'll sit down and try it again probably this upcoming year. I'm going to play through Final Fantasy X-2, and then after that, maybe I'll try Final Fantasy 13. Off-stream, in my off-stream lists, because I don't think that would be good to watch on stream. Or maybe I won't, and I'll just go play Jedi Fallen Order or something instead. I don't know. I have plenty of games that are on my lists, right? I have plenty of games to play. I don't know. You know what? I'm gonna hold on. I gotta read the copy pasta for this one, don't I? Did you know that the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV has a free tile and includes the entirety of A Realm Reborn and the award-winning Heavensward expansion up to level 60 with no restrictions on playtime? Look, it's silly. I played 14 on launch because I loved 11, and I thought 14 was going to be more like 11. It's not, Frank. Just, spoiler alert, Final Fantasy 14 is not like 11. In ways that are both good and bad. I played a lot of 14 on launch. And 1.0 was virtually unplayable. It was real bad. And then I played it after Realm Reborn came out. I have my cred in that game. Now let me just say that let me just say right now that I have my Final Fantasy XIV cred. I played the game through Bahamut's Coil turn 5 up through the Twintania fight, which I beat on 2 separate classes pre-nerf. Pre-nerf! Before it was nerfed, I was able to beat it on 2 separate classes. So I know the game. And it's not for me. Now, that's not to say it's a bad game. It's a very good game, but it's not for me. And I can explain why. The core competency, the core skill that Final Fantasy XIV asks you to learn is memorization. I don't find that as an engaging skill to learn. 14 says, can you memorize this fight? Can you memorize where you have to go and when? Can you remember to do your moves in a certain order, in a certain rotation, while remembering what order the boss is going to do their attacks, while paying attention to what's going on? And it's a lot of memorization. There's been a few memorization-based fights in other games. 5 has one or two, and yeah, 7 has one or two. But there's very few instances of that, and that's the core concept of 14. The core engagement in 14 in the boss battles is, can you remember how this fight plays out and then execute upon it? Even in 11 is more about, are you good enough at your job to be able to react when a boss does something weird that you don't expect? Are you good enough at your particular class to be able to adapt when things go sour, when things hit the wall? Can you adapt and perform your job well enough that you can overcome back-to-back Gates of Hades, or your tank getting one shot, or your ninja getting their shadow stripped as soon as they put it up and everything's on cooldown, and they got elegy on them, so they're slowed down, they have no recasts, and you have to help them survive for the next 40 seconds. It's, do you know your job well enough, and do you communicate well enough with your team, is the skill that's being tested. In 14, it's, can you remember this? Can you do enough damage in this time period? Can you memorize the patterns of the boss? Twintania, the hardest fight in the game at that time, was the epitome of this. You have to memorize the fight, otherwise you cannot do the fight. You need to do the exact same thing to the point where if you're a couple of pixels off, you will wipe the party. I'm not exaggerating either. There's actually one point in that fight where you will wipe the party if you are off by less than a meter on the ground. Like, there are characters who are about a meter wide. So, yeah. It's a good game, and it does many good things, and it handles a lot of things extraordinarily well. But it needs to be reinforced that Final Fantasy XIV is a game that does not actually require you to communicate with your team. You can join a party and do a dungeon without ever talking to anybody in the team. It's not an MMO. It is a single-player game where you join up with functionally NPCs, where you join up with other people who do their job while you do yours, and you are playing alongside each other, but you are not actually interacting with them. I don't like that. It is not a good MMO. It's a fine game, and if you enjoy that type of gameplay, it's fun, and there's a great community aspect. The people in the game are great. The people who play have a lot of fun with it. And again, I am speaking from a position of knowledge and understanding. I am speaking from a position of somebody who has played this game, you know, at an expert level for a hot minute. I wouldn't go back. Not unless the core competency changes. Not unless the core design of the game changes into something that I would enjoy and engage with more. I don't think that I would go back to 14. And that's not to say it's a bad game. It's not a bad game. It's a very good game. But I enjoyed the crafting more than the combat. It's a very MMO. Final Fantasy XI it's almost hard to put into words. Honestly, the biggest thing is the the gameplay loop that I described earlier, but like at its core level, it's a good game, but I don't think it's one that I'd return to. I've heard phenomenal things about the storyline. I've heard excellent things about the storyline. And I don't know if I can get the experience of the storyline without actually playing through the game firsthand. I have no idea if I can. Because without I don't know if I could get the storyline from watching YouTube videos or whatnot. Because, like I said, in 11 and 6 and a couple of these games, watching YouTube videos of the storyline does not give you the experience, whereas in 10 and it does. I don't know. I'll try, because I enjoyed the game enough that I want to know where the story goes. I really do want to know what happens to the world of Eorzea. I just don't want to be there myself for it. So there's my hot take on Final Fantasy XIV. XV is a game that I enjoyed. Interestingly, 15 has virtually no magic in it. The technology is so high in Final Fantasy 15 that magic might as well not exist. There's no such thing as a mage. Spells are something that only happens once in a while. Though unlike 6, where the summons are weak and decrepit and dying, in 15, the summons are actually extraordinarily powerful. They've been rebolstered as elements of the land and creatures of the planet, rather than magical elements. So, yeah. The thing with 15 that I think needs to be recommended is don't use the fast travel system. Because the game's heart, the game has a lot of heart, and the game's heart is not in the main story. It's not in the combat. Well, some of it's in the combat, but the game's heart is in the dialogue. The game is at its best when it is a bunch of buds. Sorry, pardon me. The game is at its best when it's just a bunch of buds riding in a car, hanging out, looking out the window and seeing cool stuff. The game works best when it is pure vibes and nothing else. Now, I didn't play it at launch. I played it after all the expansions were released. And I'm glad I did. And like I said before, I like playing games that are complete. I suspect that if I played through Final Fantasy 15 on launch, I would have been very sad and not enjoyed it very much. But by waiting until it had been patched and resolved, I think that I got a good experience out of it. That's why I don't want to play Deltarune now. That's why I don't want to play Final Fantasy VII Remake now. I want to wait for the game. That's why I'm not playing Cyberpunk now. I want to wait for the games to be out and fixed and completed. And I'm willing to wait. This also is how I feel about early access games, just for the record. I think that Final Fantasy 15 is at its best when it's just 4 dudes driving around having a good time. When you have banter over fishing. When someone looks out the window and says, check out that site. When you're in combat and there's just friendly banter about who's going to get the kill stroke. That's when 15 is at its best. It's at its best when it is just a chill game of a bunch of buds running around doing stuff. The actual storyline of 15 is just okay. It's not phenomenal in my opinion. It gets a bit overbearing, it gets a bit weird, not terribly weird, but, and in the end, it goes in an odd direction. And hello. But that's fine, it can have that. Much like 11 and 14, where the best parts of the game are when you're hanging out with friends, this is a single-player game that has that experience. It's a single-player game that gives you the experience of just being with a couple of buds hanging out. And I really enjoyed that. If you play Final Fantasy 15, don't fast travel. Take your time with it. Breathe, relax, lean back. Set your destination, and then walk around your location. Walk around and while the car is driving. Make yourself a snack. Grab something cold. and just vibe. Because the game wants you to vibe. The game wants you to engage with it by relaxing and just vibing with it. And when it's doing that, the game is at its best. And I think that's good. When the game is at its best, it's just great. It's a comfy romp with a bunch of dudes. I'm repeating myself, I know, but like, that's kind of the most. It took a while for me to understand items in that game. You know what? That's another thing I'll talk about. I didn't understand items for a long time playing that game because I didn't recognize the fact that you were supposed to spam them. I thought I was supposed to be saving items and I was doing something wrong in the combat based on the amount of damage that I was taking, based on the amount of time I spent dodging. No, that's just how the game is. It will take a while for Final Fantasy XV's combat to click. It's less intuitive than basically every other Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy's 1 combat is very intuitive. Final Fantasy's 2 and 3 is the same. Final Fantasy's 4's combat is very intuitive. 5, 6, 7, same. 8, 9, 10, same. 11's combat is intuitive once you get into a group, though some parts of it might need to be explained to you, or you might need to spend some time on a wiki. 14's combat is not terribly intuitive, but it's something that the game tutorializes very well and teaches you how to handle. 15's combat is not intuitive. 15's combat feels unnatural and unexpected based on A, other Final Fantasy games, and based on B, other third-person games that you would play of the same style that you would play. If you're playing a game like, if you're trying to play Final Fantasy 15 like Dark Souls, which I initially was trying to do, or if you're trying to play Final Fantasy 15 like God of War, it'll just take a while for the combat to click. But once it clicks, it's a very engaging time. Oh wow! I got a dislike for saying that. Whatever. But I think that it's a very good game. I would play it again, though I don't know when. Like, in its current form, I don't necessarily think. Oh, okay. In its current form, I don't necessarily think that I would play through Final Fantasy 15. I would want to wait for there to be a... I don't know, I've already waited for all the expansions and all the patches. But I don't know if I would just pick it. It's kind of like in the same position as 12, where it's not that I'm opposed to playing the game again. It's that I don't know that I actually would without some sort of impetus, without some sort of drive to get me to pick it up. Because I played it and I enjoyed my time with it, and I spent my time with it. I relaxed and I didn't rush anything. I just went with it and had a good time. But I don't know, and I'm not opposed to playing it again. I just don't know when I would take that opportunity. That's basically what it boils down to. I don't know when I would take the opportunity to play the game again. That covers all of them. That covers all mainline Final Fantasy games. So, real quick to touch on some of the non-main games, just because I know people are gonna, be curious on it. I've been playing through 10-2 and enjoying it. It's fine. It's not great, but it's enjoyable. I didn't play Crystal Chronicles. I never had the hardware for Dissidia, though I have played a little bit of it at a friend's house. And it seemed pretty cool. I like the way it characterizes and allows you to play some of the other... some of the characters from classic Final Fantasies. It adds a lot of personality to characters like Shantoto to be able to play them in that game. Or Bartz, for that matter. Dirge of Cerberus is hilarious. It's not a good game. Dirge of Cerberus is a litany of things that make it a terrible game. But my goodness, the game has some sort of heart to it. And it has Gact, so it's not all bad. Final Fantasy Tactics, I don't know what to tell you. I just never played it. Just never got to it. Never picked up Tactics, never tried it. I know the game, I know the style. I love XCOM, and I love, what's the other one? Heck. I love XCOM. But yeah, I just never played Tactics. Let me know if there's a good remake of that. Let me know if there's a good version of Tactics to play in modern era, in modern time. Alright. I think that about covers it, about everything that I wanted to discuss today. Bookkeeping. As I mentioned before, I will be, in the new year, it won't be right away, but I will be doing some streams on Twitch. And then I will be uploading those streams to YouTube. Unless people give me a lot of pushback, I think that will let me create better YouTube content and create more Twitch streams. So if people want more me, I might be streaming other stuff that I might not create a channel, a playlist for on YouTube. And for people who want better quality content, that will give me a chance to do a bit of editing on my YouTube side, so I can trim out any really slow segments, or maybe add a couple of annotations and make it so there's no pre-roll and post-roll in those videos. So I think that that's going to be the best solution for me on both every platform. It'll make my YouTube content better, because my YouTube content is will be then functionally pre-recorded streams, and I'm not going to do the Twitch style thing. And that's something that, ooh, oh no, uh-oh, oh no, hold on one moment, please. Uh-oh. Huh. Well, that just happened. Uh-oh. Okay, this sounds like a fantastic time to end the stream while I clean up a broken, nail polish bottle that has just spilt over my entire desk. Oh gosh, oh, this is gonna be a huge pain. Oh no, this is a problem. This is actually gonna be a problem. Uh-oh. I was gonna use this color tonight, too. Well, I think we covered everything I wanted to get to. I'm gonna clean this up. I'll meet you guys in Discord later. Cheers, friends!